Hey there, thanks for joining. Today we're going to be swapping out a 3900X for a 5900X and a fully water-cooled rig, and we're going to detail out the entire process, so stay tuned. Okay, my assumption is if you have a fully water-cooled rig like this, then you probably already know what you're doing. But perhaps you pick something like this up on the secondhand market, or maybe even got a pre-built, and now it's time to do some upgrades or perform some maintenance. So I'm going to take you through the process on how to do that, detailed step by step right now. So let's quickly talk about the machine that we're going to upgrade here. This is a pandemic build. It is made mostly out of used parts. There are a few new parts in there like the motherboard, the case, and now the CPU that we're going to be upgrading to. But everything else, or just about everything else, was actually used. And I built this machine for just about 2,000 bucks. Obviously, the brains of it is a Ryzen 9 3900X. That's seated in an Asus Crosshair 8 Hero motherboard, which was one of the new parts. And it's paired with a 32 gig kit of G.Skill DDR4 Trident Z 3600 memory. For a graphics card, we have a GTX 1080 Ti. It's an older graphics card. As you know, they're impossible to get a hold of now. That was bought used. And I was able to get my hands on an EK water block as well as backplate for that card, which was again used. Beyond that, we also have a Seasonic Focus PX850 powering the entire rig. And in terms of water cooling, we actually have kind of a hodgepodge of parts, but we have two EK radiators. We have a PE360 on the top, and that's cooled by 3 Corsair 120 fans, LED fans, kind of blowing out or venting out the top. And on the bottom, we have an XE360, and that's, again, an EK radiator that's pretty thick, and we have 3 Arctic P12s pulling air from the bottom of the case up through it. Now, both of those radiators were picked up used. They're actually in pretty rough shape, so we did some rehab on them, tore them down, cleaned them up, painted them, and they came out pretty nice. So that was a great find. And then we also have an EK Kinetic FLT 240 pump res combo. That's the flat res sitting in the back there. And that was also picked up used, and it was a little grimy. So we had to break that down, clean the entire thing before we put it into action. The CPU block is a new block. That is an EK Quantum Velocity block with the frosted plexi. Looked really nice, came out very great in this build. And then in terms of fittings, we have a whole bunch of different fittings, mostly Primo Chill Revolver fittings on the blocks themselves, but then we have some Corsair fittings, some EK fittings, some Bits Power fittings, you know, all different types of things I had in the shop that we put together. Now, in terms of the process we're going to go and do here, it's pretty basic. One, we're going to drain the loop. We're going to get enough coolant out so that we can actually pull some stuff off and work on it. Then we're going to swap the CPU. Then we're going to put everything back together and fill it up and leak test it. That's pretty much it. Now, some people will do this without actually draining the loop. Now, this is rigid tubing, and the way the bends are, it's going to be very difficult to get that block off and get enough room to actually work in there. So I'm going to opt to drain it. I'm going to take the safe road rather than have it leak everywhere. If you have soft tubing, you can probably get away with just pulling the block off and kind of bending it out of the way, and you'll still probably be able to articulate it enough to clean it off and put it back on. But in our case here, it really doesn't make sense to risk it. I don't want to get coolant all over the components. So really the safe way is to just drain the loop, not all of it in this case, but most of it, and then we'll actually get in there and have room to work. Now, if you're doing maintenance like block cleaning or your fluid flush, then obviously you want to drain the entire thing anyway. So, you know, if that's your aim, then obviously this will apply. Okay, that's enough. Let's actually get to it and start ripping apart the machine. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and open this sucker up and get the fluid out so we can do a swap. A couple tools you're going to need. One, you should hopefully have a plan on how your loop drains. If you put it together yourself, I hope you put a drain port in. If you didn't, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. This PC has a drain port. I tend to put them at the lowest point, or at least the lowest accessible point in the loop, so that it will gravity will drain out most of the liquid. This being a dual radiator setup, one on the bottom, obviously it's not going to come out there, so we probably will have to shuffle the machine a little bit to get a comfortable amount of fluid out. We don't have to totally drain it just for the CPU swap, so we should be good there. One thing I am going to use is a hose with, you really only need one fitting on the end to screw into the valve that we're going to drain out of. But in addition to that, you're going to want a container. in which you're going to put your fluid in. And again, we're going to reuse some of this fluid, so we're going to save it in here and then refill the loop when we're done. Also very important, paper towels. You're probably going to want to line different components. Now, if you have an air-cooled graphics card and you're doing this, I suggest removing the graphics card. I have a water-cooled graphics card, so it makes sense for me to remove the CPU block before I remove the graphics card anyway. So what I am going to do is lay down some paper towels on top of the graphics card just to keep it dry in case we have a couple of drips, which we probably will when we take the block and the tubing out. So with that said, let's get into it and drain this thing away. Obviously, the first step is going to be to take off the panels here. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay. I'll put those down here. Now this is, for those of you wondering what case this is a metallic gear cube. Looks kind of like the 011 Dynamic, but it's not. It's metallic gear, which is made by Fantex. Pretty nice case. It's got the glass front, obviously the glass side. Plenty of room for radiators, as you can see, and it has worked out pretty nicely for me here. I'm going to take both of these glass pieces off. Let me shift this guy so we can get better access to this here. Okay. And I'll put these down below me so I don't knock them over, hopefully. Okay, so as you can see, and I'll shift this to get a better view in here, I installed a drain port right here. So here's the outlet of the pump res. I'll move my finger so you can see it. And what I've done is put a T there so it goes out to the graphics card, but then there's also this pull valve. So a lot of times you can just use a regular ball valve. I decided to try to use a pull valve here, and what I did is I put that pull valve in there and a fitting down there so that I can run a tube out and drain it. Okay. Now, sometimes using a hose this long is kind of difficult to thread in there. So I also have a small rigid tube that I created that's going to allow me to just pop it in there. And I actually do need to get a coupler here to connect these two. It gives me a little extra distance and rigidity coming out of the cage in order to drain this thing. So I am going to first take the plug out here, which is a hex. So I need my hex tool, my Allen wrench. So I'm going to take that plug out. Okay, put the plug aside, don't want to lose that. Next, I'm going to thread in my extension here. And it doesn't need to be super tight. Gravity is going to do most of the work here. Okay, now I need to grab a coupler. We've positioned this off to the edge of the table here. We have our catch down at the bottom. Just have it sitting on a stool. I'm going to thread this tube in here. I put a 90-degree on my pipe, and this doesn't need to be super tight, watertight or anything like that, because it's going to drain just fine. But let's just thread it on there fairly easily. Okay, it's getting caught up in my mic cord, so we get that free. Bring this back, set up my catch, route the hose down in there. Okay, I'm going to hold this just so it doesn't go anywhere, but now you can see we have our pipe set up, our drain line down into our catch. It should be as easy, no, I'm going to show you the thing everybody forgets. It should be as easy as just pulling the valve, opening the valve. So I've just done that. You can see a little bit of fluids coming out, but all of a sudden, not much, right? So the other thing you need to remember here is you can't just open one line out. You need to open a port at the top to allow the air to equalize and then drain out. So I have also a fill port up here. It's actually over on this side of the case. And I'll pull this panel off. And I can't move the case because I have it all set up, but I'll move the camera just to show you where that fill port is. So you'll see it's right here. I'm going to go ahead and open this up to allow air to come in, and when I do that, we'll see that the loop will start draining down. So let me grab my Allen wrench. I'll go over the other side here. We're going to open that up, and then we're going to see some fluid go. And there she goes. Okay, so if you don't have a drain port, what you can do is take your fill port up top where you don't have fluid sitting up against it. You can put in a similar hose to what we have here, then flip the whole machine upside down. Again, you're going to want to put a plug in the end of that hose so it doesn't come rushing out when you do that or dripping out. And then open up another port once you're able to clear the fluid from there. And that should hopefully get you in a situation where you can start draining it without creating a total mess. But hopefully if you built your loop, you remember to put in a drain port like this. If not, once you drain it, again, once the difficult way, that's going to give you the opportunity to go in and retrofit it and make sure you put in a drain port to give yourself easy access for maintenance. So again, we're going to go and finish draining out this loop, and it's just going to be some tilting around, so we'll catch some of it on camera, but it does take a little bit of time. Be patient. You know, again, for us, we don't have to get all the fluid out, but you'll see here, the two lines going into the CPU are still full of liquid. So if I pull those, there's going to be a mess. So I'm going to try to get as much of this out as I can by just tilting, shifting, and moving this thing around. I'm probably going to get a shorter drain hose here as well, just because this one's not so maneuverable. Okay, so I'll be back in just a second once we're all done here. We have a little bit of fluid left in this leg here, a little bit left in the block. It's not terrible. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and remove this fitting. I just put a little catch down here, so I'll let the fluid drain there, protect it with some paper towels. That way we can go ahead and get this block off here. So we'll do that very quickly. I don't have these incredibly tight, and that's a good PSA is when you're putting on your fittings, you don't need to crush them. Don't need to over tighten them. So oftentimes hand tight is good enough, but what you're going to see here, I'm going to pull that out. Let's get that fluid to drain. Okay, that's pretty good. So that leg is now empty. There's still water left in this radiator, there's still water in both radiators a little bit, but not enough where it's going to really cause a headache here. So now I can remove both of these tubes, or what I'm going to do is actually just pull them out of the way, rotate them out of the way, trying to get as much of that fluid contained as I can. Okay, so I'll just pull it out like this. And now, perfect. Now I have a good kind of work area to get in there. I'm going to do the same thing with this guy. Okay, we're going to pull that out. All that fluid's good. I'm going to rotate this one out as well. And now we have our block exposed there. So I'll pull this little tray out, and that's good. We didn't get any fluid on top of the graphics card. Not that a little bit would have killed it, but it's always nice to just get a little less. I'm going to just take a paper towel and dab that a little bit just to get the drips. Okay, now we're ready to take that block off, expose the CPU, pull it out, drop in a new CPU, and good to go. So let's go ahead and take this block off. Okay, so we got that loop drain. We pulled the tubes out. I just swiveled them away and up, and I laid the PC down. I do this because I prefer to work in this orientation when mounting CPUs and blocks. I find it quite a bit easier to do it this way here. You have better access, you get good even pressure down there. Now I didn't have to worry about the water because there's still water in this loop leaking out. These pipes are now at the highest point of the loop, so very unlikely we're going to get water splashing up out of it, as you can see. So we're in good shape. Now what I can do now is actually go and remove this block. I took out the retention screws. So because I have the RGB cable routed underneath all the other components, great cable management, looks wonderful, but because of that I can't just pull the CPU block off. I'm going to tilt it up to the side here. I'm going to put something in to just hold it in place, and then I'm going to clean it in this orientation. So I'll actually, let's go ahead and move this here so we can see it. So I'll clean it in this orientation. I'll clean the block off. I will put the new CPU in, apply thermal paste, and then drop it back on. So let's go ahead and do that now. So now we're ready to put in the Ryzen 5000 CPU, and this is a quick PSA. Double check your BIOS, double check your motherboard. Make sure obviously your motherboard supports 5000 series, but also make sure that you have a BIOS version or revision that supports these chips as well. Just because the motherboard supports it doesn't mean that it's ready to go right out of the box. You might need to upgrade your BIOS. It would be a shame to get this loop put back together and find out, oh, I need to go update the BIOS, and if I don't have flashback, that means I need to put the old chip in and go through this entire process again. So double check that before you start. Save yourself a little bit of headache. So here we go. We're going to go drop this in. The first thing I'm going to do is just give it a quick wipe down with alcohol, make sure it's perfectly clean, which it should be, but I always like to just double check. I'm going to do that down here off camera, and then I'll give it a quick wipe with a microfiber towel and a quick blast of air as well, just to make sure it's clean. Okay, now I don't normally do this, but since it is very tight quarters in here, I am actually going to apply the thermal paste outside the case and drop the CPU in with the thermal paste already applied. It's going to be a little bit easier to get that application with a little bit more working room. And we'll kind of move the camera around so we can see it right on the edge of the table here. I'm going to give it, as I said, just a light blast of air. Same thing with the socket and the block. Okay. Just take a quick look under the light. Yeah, it looks good. So as I said, I'm going to use this Kingpin KPX grease. It's the blue stuff. Everybody has their own methodology on how they like to apply thermal paste. I've been doing it this way for years. This is the way I prefer to do it. Some people may like it, others may not, but this is the way I like to do it, so I'm going to do it. What I do is I just take a little dab. I'd usually do a couple dabs, but one right in the center there, maybe a couple on the sides. That's probably going to be enough there. And I like to use cut up business cards. So these are my old business cards before we rebranded. What I do is I use them as a spreader. I like them better. They're flexible. They allow me to create a nice thin layer on there. I have those plastic spreaders. I've used them. They're okay. I just don't like them as much as this. And this stuff is nice and thin, so you're basically painting it on. I like some thermal pastes are very thick or old and very difficult to apply. I like to get it right up to the edge. Again, I know this doesn't really matter. This is just a personal preference thing. I just like to get a nice, fairly even, thin layer all around the IHS. Okay, so we got a nice even layer there. The other thing I do is just go along the edges, grab any spillover. It's not much. I'm usually pretty careful about this, but I just like to get as much of that spillover off as I can so it doesn't bleed out over the side. Okay. Oh, so now we got our chip ready to go. Now we got to drop it in here, and this is kind of tight quarters. Make sure you got your orientation right. And she's in. Okay, still looks good. So now we're going to drop this block right back on. Sorry if I'm blocking the camera, but helps if you actually seat the CPU, doesn't it? Okay, now we can put the block back on. Okay, now we got the block right back on, and move this up a little closer. You can see it there. Just wiggled it around a little bit. Make sure it's seated on, spread out nicely. Now we will go and crank her down. Okay, now we can swivel down our fittings. So let's do this one first. Drop them in there. Okay, same with this guy. Okay, we'll grab our little wrench. Again, I don't overly tighten these, but I do like to use the little wrench key for the last couple turns, just to make sure they're nice and snug, but not overly tight. Okay, so we got the machine back together. We tightened down those fittings. I just wiped down real quick, make sure I didn't miss any of the leaking fluid from when we drained it. Just make sure it's all dry off. Now the reason I do this and try to get all of the fluid that may have dripped or leaked during the loop maintenance is because when I fire this up, I'm going to want to check for leaks. And if there's a drip somewhere, I want to know if it's a drip from when I was disassembling it, or if it's dripped maybe from a component. So it just helps remove some doubt there. Make sure that you have everything kind of cleaned up and ready to go. And I got some fingerprints on there, so I'll have to clean those off later. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the fill port, close off the drain port down here. The valve's already closed, but I always put a plug in just in case. Okay, that's good. Now we can fill our loop. So on this one, as we saw, I have the fill port, just a little piping that's back here. I use a little squeeze bottle, have some coolant in there. Pretty easy. And the process here is pretty simple. I'll just fill the reservoir up, and I'll move it over so we can actually see the reservoir. Okay. So you can see the reservoir being filled up here. And once I get that reservoir decently full, probably up to about here, I'll turn the pump on and start filling the loop. And then I'll pause when it gets low. You don't ever want to run this pump dry. So when it starts to get low, I'll pause it, put more fluid in. run it again. So here's a quick shot of the power supply setup. Basically what we have over here is a power supply. We have a little jumper that goes on the motherboard connector, which allows us to run that power supply while it's not connected to a motherboard itself. And then we just took the Molex connector and we plugged it into the pump on the machine here. So this will allow us to run this pump while the rest of the computer is powered off. And that way, if there's a leak or any problems, then we're not gonna have electricity flowing through the components and potentially damage or fry them. So I've just kind of filled the reservoir up here. I'm gonna run the pump till the fluid goes down to about here. And then I'm gonna cut it off because we don't want to run this pump dry. And once I create some more room here, I'll fill the reservoir back up and just rinse and repeat until we get the loop full. So I'm gonna turn on this power supply over here. You'll see that pump will spin up in just a second. And we see the level going down. And I'm going to stop it there. It looks like the loop is pretty full, otherwise that would go down a lot faster, but I'm just going to go in now and top off that loop. And I need to put some more coolant in my little squirt bottle here. And once we have that loop full, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it for a few minutes and inspect it. I want to make sure that I'm not getting any leaks anywhere. Obviously we did do a little bit of movement on this, you know, moving some of the tubing around, playing with a couple of the fittings and just generally shaking things up. So I want to make sure that we didn't knock anything loose and create any leaks. And the way we're going to do that is by running the pump and just observing, going around looking at all the fittings. It's nice having a colored fluid here because especially against a white case, you'll very quickly see any drips. And that'll be the indication that something's not quite right and we might have to go back and reseat some fittings or, you know, God forbid, replace an O-ring if it's something more severe. But this is a fairly new build, so I really don't expect any issues in terms of leaks, but we want to check it just in case, especially if you end up having a leak that's not immediately visible. So for example, maybe on the back side of the reservoir, you have this sitting on a desk, you might not notice it. That can be a situation you do not want to be in. So let's get this fired up. And again, I expect, you know, we're not going to see much movement in here. And get that coolant pumping through. And when you first do this, you're going to get a lot of bubbles. That's okay. The bubbles will work out over time, so don't be concerned if you have a lot of bubbles flowing through your loop or a lot of bubbles up here. That's totally normal. Just let it sit and it'll end up disappearing. So I'm just looking around. I'll grab the camera and we'll just kind of take a tour around this thing and look at what we got. So we got this pump running full tilt. You can see some of the turbulence in there. It's good. I don't see any leaks down there. On the back side, that's just a little spill from me filling it. There's a couple little drips there. I think that's, again, from me spilling it. I think I mentioned this earlier, but you always want to wipe everything down just in case. So when you see something like that, you know where it came from. So I'll have to wipe that up. I'm pretty sure that's from my fill port when I was got a little aggressive putting some coolant in there. So I don't think that's much of an issue. Really what I want to pay attention to here is the CPU block, because these are the fittings that I played with the most. And those look good. The fitting up there on the radiator looks good. Fitting down here on the radiator looks good. So at this point, I'm pretty much ready to call this a success. I'll let the loop run for a little bit. Again, just kind of keeping an eye on it, make sure nothing develops. I'll probably top off the fluid just a little bit. I like to bring it right up to the top there. And then this bad boy's ready to plug in and use. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, feel free to subscribe. I'm going to be producing a whole series of these videos that's going to chronicle the build process for a rig similar to this, from parts selection, paper design, loop design, through the actual build process, all the way through to when we install the OS and even overclock the thing. So if you found this useful, I think you'll be interested in those videos, and I look forward to it, and I'll see you then.